A brief introduction to today's session. Basically, the focus will be on paper. If you were here yesterday, the focus was on paintings on canvas. No? Um, so our lecturers, presenters are Marga Villanueva, the assistant to the director and manager of conservation of the Lopez Museum and Library, together with Rodrigo Enano, a senior conservation technician who has undergone training in paper conservation and paper making. So we'll proceed with the presentation. Marga, thanks.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us for this talk. I see a lot of familiar faces from yesterday, and I'm hoping that you'll find this talk useful and interesting. So to give a background, as mentioned, we wanted to focus on caring for collections in the tropics, in the Philippines, because our conditions tend to present different challenges than perhaps what we might be familiar with abroad. In the Philippines and Southeast Asian regions, it's really the extreme humidity and heat that pose our challenges to the care of art, but also other cultural materials. Museums like ours at Lopez are tasked with the preservation of collections, and doing that, we're forced to take intensive measures to control storage, for example, and our gallery conditions. We use specialized HVAC systems and have dedicated preservation specialists from conservation teams to also collections management team. But what can be done on a domestic level? This talk discusses common types of damage in homes encountered by our team, particularly in relation to works on paper today. We hope to assist custodians and makers with the maintenance of their collections by deepening your understanding of how damage occurs, what measures can be done for preventive care, and when to call a conservator. So just to give a background on the Lopez Museum, we are a Filipiniana institution that was founded in 1960 by Eugenio Lopez Sr. It serves as a resource for Philippine history, arts, and culture, with a collection that spans the 1500s to present day, from rare books, maps, periodicals, manuscripts, to also photographs, ceramics, and fine arts. While we are presently building an urban outpost in Rockwell, which will host our exhibitions and public programming, we will continue to have preservation as a major initiative, particularly at our off-site storage facility and conservation lab. Because of the nature of materials in our collection, our lab specializes in paintings, books, and works on paper. Our conservation approach to collections care is certainly rooted in a museum context, as mentioned, where conditions are quite controlled in comparison to domestic homes. But because we also service private clients and other institutions, sometimes provincial, that might not have the same controls, we thought we could share what we've learned through the years and see what maybe you could adapt and integrate into your own practices. We thought to kind of divide our talks with paintings and paper and really focus today on paper, because I've found that many can be intimidated by paper. Many find that it can be a bit tough to care for, and maybe for collectors that means it could be prohibitive to support, and maybe makers might second guess. But this is a medium that I really love and I hope proliferates, and I'm hoping that through this talk you'll maybe understand how it can actually be mitigated, and it'll make you feel a bit more confident to support works on paper. So before I begin, I thought I would start with giving a bit of a background, a historical background, and starting with paper milestones over the years, particularly in production. I like to mention dates because paper production has changed so much over the centuries, and its composition and production method has had a major impact on how these objects age and degrade over time, which has a bearing, of course, on how we preserve them and what can be done to restore them. In medieval times, so this is the pre-1500s, paper was actually at perhaps its best quality. They tended to use, the production in mills depended almost entirely on linen, hemp, and cotton rags, so that the raw cellulosic material didn't have the impurities that perhaps we see today. With the invention of printing, the printing press, production demands were abound, and paper makers were forced to develop the way manufacturing occurred. So with paper printing, you start to see the introduction of mechanization, and with mechanization and the type of sizings and preparatory materials put into paper, you start to see the introduction of impurities. So this starts to take place in the late 1500s after the Gutenberg press is widely used. And then jump forward to the late 1800s, and soon there is a need to introduce other fibers, not just cottons. And we start to see wood pulps come into use very strongly, as well as a fully mechanized production, which means lower fibers. What I wanted to show here is that although we're looking chronologically, pre-1500s method, late 1500s, and then late 1800s, it's actually declines in quality of materials. So you'll see this, one of our manuscripts in the collection. This is a manuscript. It's from 1753, but it uses the methods that predated and were abound during the medieval period. You'll notice the papers are very white, and these are not restored. These haven't been touched. And these volumes have been in our collection for about 60 years and are still in fantastic shape. These are raw cotton papers. And you see that, which they would have used with animal glue sizing. I suspect that they used cotton here, even if it's in the 1700s, because these were royal decrees. This is part of a collection we have of government documents during the colonial period. And I took a photo of this one because I found it particularly interesting. This is a royal decree for the freedom of black slaves in the Philippines. And this was about 100 years before black slavery was liberated in America. After handmade papers, you see the introduction of printing press impurities. This is a rare book from our collection from 1640. It is a chronicle of how that is an account of Christianity, of missionary efforts, not just in the Philippines, but also in Japan and China. And it's a particularly interesting source for Philippine history because it responds to the comprehensive but only partially successful efforts of Spanish missionaries. Very interesting document. And I thought to show this because it was also printed in Manila. It is one of our early Philippine imprints. You see here how different the paper is from the previous manuscript that we had shown. It's a bit browner, and this is where you start to see the mixture of a different sizing. The previous was an animal glue sizing, and now they start putting in alum fillers together with the sizing that at the time they aimed to reduce biodeterioration and also to control the viscosity of the fibers. And jump forward to the late 1800s. This is an example of a periodical from our collection called La Opinion, a daily newspaper. With the increased demand for paper, increased the need to introduce other fibers, as mentioned. And these are actually the toughest to care for. Here you start to see rosin added to sizing, and these tend to be of lower quality papers. To better understand why Sorry, just going back a sec. To understand why this is the case, I thought we could start with kind of talking a little bit about the common damages of paper. We'll start with the anatomy of the paper, and we'll look at the degradation process, and then we'll start sharing about the common damages that we find. So for those of you that were here yesterday when we spoke about paintings, common damages for paintings, we had talked a lot about environmental damage. And we talked a lot about mechanical damage, how paintings crack, how canvases get distorted, and how things get torn. When it comes to paper, we find that in most of the projects that we've taken on, and a lot of institutions that also care for works, the greatest concern really is chemical deterioration. And I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. So to start off, I thought I'd present a cross-section of anatomy of a paper. So paper, unlike maybe painting canvases, don't have the structural layers. You're painting directly on the support. The media might sit very lightly on it, but for the most part, we're really looking at the paper itself when we're thinking about the deterioration, unlike maybe for paintings when we're thinking about the paint film. There are two ways in which the media sits on paper and doesn't bleed through, and that's through what we call sizing. And there are two ways in which sizing gets incorporated into paper. It can be in the structure, where sizing is mixed with the pulp before they dry and make the sheets. But it can also be added to the surface of paper. And this is what holds your inks, your paints, or even graphite to the surface of the papers. And now I thought I'd kind of go into the actual structure. So a little anatomy. So this is a paper sheet, as we maybe see it from day to day. But what is it actually made of? Oops. So paper has a microstructure. And it's a microstructure of individual fibers that are pressed together with a lot of pressure. These microstructures are made of individual fibers, which we call the paper-making fibers. And these fibers tend to look a little like fettuccine noodles with a hole inside, kind of like a flat straw. The structure itself is composed of an almost crystalline kind of structure, which we call the lamella. And if you're looking at the lamella on a two-dimensional form, it's basically all those ribbons stacked together, or all the fettuccine noodles stacked together. And these are held together loosely in what can be thought of almost a magnetic relationship through hydrogen bonding. And the chains that are being held together are cellulosic chains. And this is why cotton papers are so wonderfully high quality, because it has because it's relatively pure cellulose. I hope this isn't too intimidating a slide, but taking you all back to maybe high school chemistry class. A cellulose is a really long, as I say, kind of like a flat ribbon you can think of, bound together. And what distinguishes why cotton is so much stronger than wood pulp is the length of the chain. If you imagine the ribbon, this unit, called the anhydrous glucose unit, gets repeated. And the number of repetitions of this determines the length, or what we call the degree of polymerization. And I thought I'd just give you an idea, just to get a sense of how much stronger cotton is compared to wooden pulp. Wooden pulp has a degree of polymerization of about 600 to 1,500, whereas cotton is 15,000. So it's more than 10 times stronger, really, than paper. And what this does is it means you create a really strong paper structure. And what that also means is the strength of that structure, because all of these fibers are pressed together, is what really holds the paper. And when that starts to break down is when you get problems. And you start perhaps to see brittleness in papers. They break easy. You'll notice that fresh paper is quite pliable. It has a degree of moisture content in it. Sorry, the little video. Don't know if that's starting. Yeah, just made a little video to show how the acidity, acidity tends to break down the fibers. And what I wanted to show here is that although we tend to call this acidic degradation, acidity is introduced, but it's also water and moisture that sort of drives this reaction. And that's important to us because we're in a very humid and tropical climate and there's moisture everywhere. So when it comes to paper, yesterday we might have looked at moisture in terms of mechanical and expansion properties in cracking paint films. But when it comes to paper, it's really about breaking down the cellulose material and making your paper drier and more brittle over time. This tends to be the main source of damage for works of art. And acidity can come from many places. This is an example of a map that was created from wood pulp. So this would be an example of something in the late 1800s and beyond. And the trouble with the type of paper processes of that period and the rosin sizing, for example, is that it introduced acidity to the paper itself, which means it's continually producing acidity and degrading the fibers within it. And this I wanted to show as an example of the extent of degradation. So here on the right, we've the map after we've treated it in the conservation lab and washed the acidity off. And it's to show you where it started and where it ended. And we were able to produce pliability back. Another source of acidity are through external means. I thought that this particularly was a good example because maybe you've seen this a lot before. But plywood tends to be a material that is a very acidic wood. And for the most part, for a lot of the 20th century, you'll see a lot of works in paper that were glued to plywood. And not just glued to plywood, but glued with rugby to plywood. And so this is what's breaking down and eating up all of the papers and causing it to be brittle over time. And doing that in a really rapid way. This, for example, is a Manansala from 85. And you'll see, compared to that manuscript that you saw that's 400 years old, this is only decades old, yet is in far worse shape. In this case, the acidity kind of creeps up from the plywood itself into the paper structure. And I wanted to show the different layers of compounded acidity. The first image is us removing one of the plies. Plywood is made of several ply. Marine ply could be 7 layers. Regular ply could be 5. There are thinner plies that are 3. But the nature of glues that keep the plywood together, in addition to the poor quality of wood, all end up migrating onto the artwork. And in this second photo, you can see us removing the final layer of plywood to reveal a rugby layer. So not only is the wood introducing acidity, but also the adhesive that was used to stick the artwork onto the wood. Another source that might not be so obvious, and perhaps you're wondering, is why is this darker? And why is it lighter below? This kind of window that's a bit darker, this rectangular window, is what was exposed by the frame. I wanted to show you that light also becomes kind of catalytic. It also encourages the evolution of acidity. So you can see the part of this artwork that was covered beneath the frame is actually quite white. It held up a little bit better over time, whereas those that were the areas that were exposed to light, in this case, this home was just natural light with a regular glass, you start to see how the paper also degrades further. So what do you do about it? How do you mitigate acidity? what we hope that perhaps you can do at home, especially for those purchasing new works, is really paying attention to the framing of your materials. It's really important to be cautious of the sources of acidity and to remove them. And so you want to remove the acidity, but also introduce archival materials. In this particular work, we were able to remove the plywood from the sheet, and we removed this from the back. And what we did is we reframed the artwork, and we made sure to use acid-free materials. And what Rod will show shortly during the conservation demonstration for the framing is that we added an acid-free barrier to the back to help, again, protect it. And then we end up mounting an acid-free foam board behind that archival barrier. And what we do, and this was a question that came up yesterday, someone asked, what if there are inscriptions at the back? What do you do? We keep it intact. So this is a really difficult process, but we end up, and this is something that Rod has become quite expert at, but he's able to remove the first ply and keep the inscriptions intact. And then we then attach it to make sure that the provenance of the work is always together. One thing that I wanted to share with the acid-free barrier, or I'm hoping that is a takeaway from what we just ran through, is how acidity migrates. While in the same way that the acidic source tends to introduce acidity to the papers, you can introduce alkaline materials, and that acidity over time can slowly transfer to the alkaline material. This is a technique that you see a lot in libraries, for example, called interleaving. When you're dealing with mass collections and loads of paper, and you're unable to do mass treatments, what a lot of libraries do is just simply place alkaline sheets between the acidic papers, and over time, it'll slowly start to deacidify your papers. You might not see a direct impact in the way that we do now, in the way that we wash, but I think this is something really useful that perhaps you can do in your homes when mitigating the damage to acidity or caring for your works. And something that is good to be aware of also is that they do need to be changed. So when you're placing this alkaline sheet and drawing the acidity from the paper, the alkaline sheet will eventually become acidic as well. And all you really need to do is change that sheet into a fresh sheet of paper. So this is something that perhaps when you're taking on wood pulp papers or even new works that might be on, even if they have, they might be painted on archival materials today, over time, acidity does find a way a little bit. And this is one way I think you can use framing as a means of mitigating that. Another source of damage that we commonly see in homes are damage through light. As I showed you earlier, light can catalyze and encourage the spread of acidity, but it can also fade a lot of the media, especially if you have watercolor paints, some dyed inks. So it's always good to keep in mind to have a protective layer. Today, you do have a lot of options in terms of how this can be done. We tend to recommend conservation grade glass, which has a UV coated film. We really like working with this because then it gives you flexibilities on where you can actually hang your work. It kind of works a little bit like sunblock in terms of protecting that initial burn, although of course, light tends to be compounded. So this is still something that is good to mitigate and think about in terms of your light exposures. There was also a question of the use of glass. Glass, I know, tends to be a bit distracting. It's very tempting, and of course, you're always wanting to see the original piece. But there are actually coatings out there that you can opt for by framers that are non-reflective glass, and you can also have option for plexiglass. There are acrylate glasses today that aren't as reflective but still allow you the protection and to be able to see the work. And when it comes to artificial lighting, we tend to heavily discourage halogen lights. I think most people have already switched to LEDs, but that's something, again, to be quite conscious of. Light damage is cumulative. Light is not something we can restore or take back. Once something fades, it permanently fades. So it's a great idea and really important to really be on the preventive side. And it doesn't really take much, just using glass and archival material. Another common damage we tend to come across is mold. I'm sure you've all experienced mold, not just for artwork, but maybe in your homes. And this, again, is something great to be vigilant about. Mold tends to be prompted by humidity. And of course, we're in the tropics, and so this tends to be a bit harder to manage and mitigate. But it's generally a good idea to avoid sources of moisture. So in a home setting, this might be maybe avoiding hanging works of art in the bathroom or in your kitchen or where there could be piping, and maybe keeping it in rooms that are a bit drier and not so exposed. In terms of how mold causes damage, it gets very attracted to moisture as well as organic materials, which tends to be a food for mold. And for a lot of artwork, that tends to be the media and also the sizing and cellulose itself. Mold does enjoy feeding on that. And of course, oxygen. And what it does, and why we're so conscious of preventing it from really spreading, is it tends to degrade a lot of the media that might be sitting on your paper. So this could be prints, but also watercolors and other forms of art. And another element that is quite difficult is mold roots. Because this is biological and not just surface dirt, it does tend to root a little bit into the paper. So you kind of want to make sure that you're caring for it, and again, working more in the preventive side. Another way of sort of mitigating mold, apart from managing the sources of humidity, would be enclosures. If you're exhibiting works in, for example, an enclosed display like a plexiglass, that's just something that you might want to keep an eye out on. You'll see that a lot in institutions, perhaps, and museums are able to have these types of enclosures because we have a very controlled space. But in the home, it might not be that way. It might be quite humid in your spaces. So if you do tend to go this route, which in a way is great because it protects the work from surface dirt, it's best to keep an eye out in case mold occurs. And when it comes to storage, it's still best to wrap the works in paper. You can use bubble wrap during transit, but it's really best to not store works of art, whether they be paintings or works on paper, in bubble wrap, as it tends to trap the humidity. So if you have a work that's wrapped in bubble wrap, even if it's an air-conditioned room, the humidity is inside because it might be drying the room, but it's unable to dry out the humidity that's trapped inside. So that's something to be aware of. Other forms of damage to look out for paper, of course, are that we tend to encounter are water leaks, and this is why framing tends to be quite important. We're emphasizing framing a lot today because it's just a simple measure that can avoid many things. Some accidental tearing. This was a Japanese screen that we had worked on that was accidentally kind of brushed and torn. And also we tend to see damage a lot from tape. We've seen in the home setting, maybe maybe it was a remedial, well-intentioned fix in the past of just putting some tape onto torn paper. But tape is actually quite acidic. So again, it introduces that acidity that we're trying to avoid and can be tough to repair. So that's something also to kind of look out for. So today I'll now be turning you over to Rod. I'm hoping that framing can be something that you can all focus on as an easy sort of approach to the care of works of art. Through framing alone, you can avoid so many sources of degradation from acidity to accidental tearing, protection from surface dirt and insects, and also handling. I'll now turn over to Rod. Thanks. Do you want to? While doing the demonstration, feel free if you have any questions, because we can also do a question and answer as Rod is working on the frames.
So, good morning, everyone. So, I'm gonna demo for you how we mount our object in a frame. So, sometimes we always do mounting in our museum. If we ask sometimes our framer to cut the matting and then the board, and then they will just bring it in our museum. Then we'll be the one to mount the artwork, the object artwork in the matting. So, example, if this is already your object, and then you have already, they had already cut the matting and the foam board. Simple technique for centering of our object is when your artwork, just move your object in the center of the matting and adjust it. You overlap it about 1.5 or 2 inches. And then get your matting, put it on top, center, isi-center nyo na which yung tamang view for sa inyo, and then flip it patalikod. And then don't remove the board. Inagawa ko, we put yung heavy ruler on top it, and then we'll paste the edges. So what we use here are RK0 or Japanese tissue. And then we mount it with MC paste. This one. In mounting, you first mount the tissue on the support about 2 to 3 millimeters, parang yung maliit lang. And then, paste it with MC paste. Doon po muna yan, doon sa artwork nyo. Huwag nyo po munang ipi-paste, don't paste it yet on the matting. And then let it dry, kasi pag nag-paste ho kayo sa paper nyo, pag nilagyan nyo ng wet, nagwa-warp po, parang kumukulubot. So, bayaan nyo siya na mag-adjust. Pagka na-dry, saka nyo ididikit dun sa matting. Kasi pagka dinirect nyo na pination, pag nag-dry ho yun dun sa yung nasa object nyo, sa support ng object nyo, magkakaroon ng diferensya dahil hinahatak nyo ulit, yung nag-shrink yung paper. So, kaya kailangan i-dry nyo muna bago nyo idikit. So, if nag-dry na po siya, saka nyo lang po ididikit yan sa matting, which mag-iiwan din kayo ng 3 millimeters, 2 to 3 millimeters from the object. Okay.
I just wanted to explain a little bit. This is a method of mounting that we do in the museum. Because we don't often frame our works, in the sense that once we frame it, we tend to have it in the collection for many years. We don't tend to use a lot of adhesives. You can frame at home using archival tapes, but what we have found is sometimes using some archival tapes might not be strong enough, and we do tend to get into the issue of works falling within the frame. Sometimes it happens. And when it comes to quite maybe new works that are quite strong, where the papers are not so brittle and you can handle it, it's not a problem. For example, if you're purchasing contemporary pieces, you can just retape it and remount it. But because a lot of the pieces in our collection are quite fragile, we try not to handle it as much as possible. So this method that we use is we create, in a way, our own tape. We use the tissues that Rod is demonstrating now are made of mulberry. These are Japanese archival tissues. And what MC paste is methyl cellulose paste. In a way, methyl cellulose is like liquid paper. As we showed earlier, paper is composed of cellulose. So what we do is we introduce cellulose back into the paper structure to create that adhesion. And that way you remain without impurities. And what he's showing you now is the paste that we make and how he applies it to the matting to hinge the artwork.
Okay. So after it dries, we put a barrier paper, which is acid-free, in between the foam board and your object.
So this acid-free paper is what we had talked about earlier. You can think of it as the sacrificial paper. This is the paper that will eventually become a bit acidic over time and that you might have to change.
So after it dries, you can put it on your frame. So I'll show you how we tack also our object.
Rod is now using a foam board backing. So in many ways, this sort of fulfills the same functions that a plywood had, to have this rigid support supporting the paper from behind. So rather than using plywood, we use foam board backing. So this is an archival foam that is sandwiched between two sheets of archival paper. And what it does is it gives your works the support it needs to stay within the frame, while also not introducing acidity through.
So, pag we attach our object, we're using this stacker. Or kung wala naman kayo, this one, we can use the offset holder like yung ginamit kahapon. So, pagka malalim, you can use this, invert it, para mag-push. Pero pagka overlap, mas mataas naman yung foam board nyo, invert naman yun para sa taas naman. So there are different size ng offset.
Marga, on
Yes?
the average, how long would the acid-free barrier last? So more or less, we know when should we check? Is it yearly or every 2 years?
For us at the museum, sometimes 5 years or beyond.
But you have
But
ideal
maybe that's true.
conditions.
But maybe in
yeah.
a domestic setting, you can check every other year. It doesn't have to be so cumbersome. And all it really takes is just taking a peek and looking through. So part of why we also like using these tackers is because it's easy to remove and redo. Oftentimes, we've seen framing that is heavily taped and maybe uses nails to keep the foam board in the frame, and that becomes rather cumbersome if you're checking, especially on the maintenance side. So these framer stacks, you can easily remove them, open the foam board, and then check if you see any discoloration in the paper. Discoloration is a good indication of when it's time to change. You don't have to test the pH or anything at home. It can be a simple visual observation. And unless it's really brown, you don't need to change the acid-free board either. So this is something, yeah, every 2 years, every 3 years. You don't really have to check it so often. Maybe exceptions would be if you notice your object is really deteriorated. So if you have a work, like an old piece of work that had been acidic for a very long time, like some of the papers I showed you, like that very brown map, for example, because it has such a high acidic concentration, you probably have to check on that one a bit sooner. But even a year or so is still okay.
So we use this tape for the back of the frame to seal it. No, pagka sinisil nyo, dahan-dahan, hindi ho yung kagad-agad. So, pabalik-balik, papasok dun sa loob.
We like to apply this tape so that the dirt doesn't enter through the edges of the foam board to the back. But as you notice and as Rod showed, you can easily just kind of slice it to be able to remove and then retack and then just apply again. So whenever we are doing any sort of framing, we're always thinking about future. We're always thinking about whether it be replacing that acid-free sort of barrier or the foam board. We're also quite careful about wearing gloves. Especially when handling papers, our hands tend to have oils that can also cause degradation to the paper. So it's always a good idea, especially when framing, to have gloves. It's also neater when you're cleaning the glass and not getting prints inside. The question was if this was, perhaps you can bring the mic.
Is being used? Is it the ordinary or
This
special
is just
tape?
ordinary paper tape.
Paper tape. The
We
one you
use
for
a
packaging.
thin, we like to use like a very thin, this is just craft paper tape.
The one we use for our boxes, right? The one.
This we
Paper.
use, we can, I can share the label with you. It's just
Hindi.
It's just a craft paper. Yeah, it's on the outside and it's not touching like the more important surfaces, so it's okay. So you don't have to. We tend to use archival tapes if it's touching the artwork, but if it's just the backing board, it's okay. It won't introduce unreasonable amounts of acidity to the work.
What framers often use would be the brown paper tape that you wet. Like
Yes.
Is that still acceptable?
That's still fine
Just for the backing, no?
for the backing. That's just the mounting and sealing in the edges of the frame so that the dust and dirt is not going in. But it's okay. It won't introduce a great volume of acidity, so you can be relaxed about it.
Mahal yung archival tape
Yeah.
na ano eh. There's an archival tape like that, but it's too expensive if you use it very liberally in that way.
It's true. Even at the museum, we're always thinking about the cost of things. So we're always trying to think what is really needed. When wrapping, for example, artworks, if you're wrapping it in pieces of paper, even for storage, you don't need to use archival tape. You can use like magic tape, or because that's not touching the artwork. So that's fine when it's in storage. Those can be quite expensive as well. But going back to our hinging method of using the methyl cellulose paste, if you don't have access to that, you can also use just store-bought archival tapes as well. Just maybe avoid masking tapes and scotch tapes because those are particularly acidic. Another mounting method you could maybe try are photo corners. So photo corners are often used for photographs, but you can also use it for works on paper. And what's great about photo corners is there's no adhesion at all. The corners are attached to the back mat and you just slip the papers in. So that's also another great, very available archival method.
What we do actually is to make photo corners out of mylar strips. So you can adjust if it's medyo big, because photo corners come only in one size.
That's right.
But if you want a bigger size, you can actually slice strips of mylar and then fold it, create a corner, and then that will be attached onto the backing, and just slip in the paper, the artwork. Can you pass the label?
Sorry.
That one, Martin. Yeah.
Sure.
Sige, sige. And then here.
Hello. Hi.
Hi,
Yes.
Matthew.
Yeah, thank. I have a question on because works on paper is not artworks; it's also printed material, so prints, lithographs, maps. So should the same conservation techniques can those be applied on those types of materials as well? Especially like newsprint, which I know, especially here, easily deteriorates, faxing and whatnot. So could those same techniques be applied here in this case?
Yes, definitely. So when I spoke earlier about the wood pulps, documents, maps actually tend to be made more from woods, well, depending on the age, really. Of course, if it's maps in rare books, that would be more in the printing press style. But they're more susceptible, as you mentioned, to aging. So even more archival materials should really be invested in. I should qualify that while I gave a history of kind of milestones in paper making, a lot of artist papers were still made of cotton. They were still rather high quality. And I think even today, if you go to an art supply store and you're looking for maybe watercolor paper, archival and cotton tend to be almost synonymous. Artists in the room, I'm sure, know that. So actually, it's the documents that are more difficult to care for. Artworks tend to be a bit more durable because they tend to have a higher cotton composition. And it's the same. You can have your acid-free barrier paper, and the moment it gets a bit acidic, you can change it. I'm glad you mentioned newsprint, because newsprint really is one of the more vulnerable materials to care for, especially in the 20th century. Paper-making industry has adapted since. There are now new fillers and new treatments, and they do buffer a lot of the papers today. But if you are a collector, especially of 20th century, early 20th century, I would definitely recommend to be using acid-free boards.
Hi. So I have a question, I guess kind of related, asking about, maybe this is helpful then for mga artists now who are looking to archive their own sketches and for collectors who have a body of work that who like collecting body of work, including my sketches, stuff like that, stuff that wasn't necessarily intended by the artist to be maybe exhibited or presented. Um, how do you deal with? Is it the same? Would you recommend the same conservation methods in mounting it and keeping it, treating it the same way you would as if it was intentionally meant to be exhibited or viewed, or is there a different approach that you would take on how would you archive mga sketches? And yeah,
I think if you have quite a few sketches, um, and maybe don't have a need to display all of them and have frames for each one, I would recommend the interleaving method that we use in library material. So rather than putting the sketches touching each other, I would put an acid-free sheet just between. And if you have quite a few, honestly, like in this day and age, a lot of readily available papers are already quite alkaline. They might not last as long as higher grade archival sheets, but when you have your sketches, what you can do is just insert fresh sheets in between, and then you can keep it in a folder.
and then I guess just a follow up that earlier during the talk you mentioned how light exposure can fade materials or help damage the paper. In this age where we like to digitize and like to scan, would like regular home office scanners present that risk of damage if you're trying to digitize to preserve maybe digitally the print?
Light damage tends to be cumulative. In museums, for example, we measure it by lux hours. So if it's a scan, it's such a brief moment as opposed to an 8-hour exposure that it's fine. We would definitely encourage you to scan and archive. And even taking photographs, if you have to use flash just momentarily, these are just, again, moments. In museums, they often prohibit flash because so many people come. So it's an accumulation of so many moments. But if you're with your collection and you're preparing your archive, it's fine. It's all right.
Thank you.
I'm wondering for photo paper, is there any others? Is there anything different that we have to do for photographers to preserve their works?
I think, well, for photography, because you have a sort of emulsion layers and it's sort of a coated paper support, I would say the media, the emulsion, is what becomes the center of your concern when it comes to photography. And again, humidity comes into play there. It might be susceptible to mold, and also light plays a factor. It could affect the media, whether it be fading or discoloration, or even a changing of the colors. So for that, I would recommend the same, just being conscious of where it's hung. And maybe if you are framing photographs, it might be good to invest in something with a UV protection if you want the flexibility. But if it's being hung, for example, in the same place, and you're not really looking to have it in a very bright room, you can also use regular glass or plexi.
So that means, sorry. So regarding the light issue, so does that mean that if you have a print painting in a room, you need like really strong curtains for the morning?
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Sorry. Regarding the print, the light. For example, you're in a condo, so you put like prints, paintings on the wall. Do you need to put a window curtains or something to prevent the light from being overexposing or to control the light coming into the condo?
That's not a bad practice to have. I mean, of course, I wouldn't want everyone to board up their walls and live in darkness or anything like that. But what you can do is just watch out for direct sunlight. So if you have a light that's shining directly, especially maybe like sunrise, sunset, where you really get the strong period of day, maybe at that point you kind of want to maybe have a curtain. But when it comes to paintings, for example, you could opt. They do have UV stable matte varnishes now. So that can be an option if you're an artist um, or if you're working with an artist maybe or if you've had something cleaned, to give you flexibility so you can enjoy them. You can enjoy the works, you can live with it, whether it be in your living room during the day. But maybe just be conscious of, maybe if you're not in that room, maybe you don't have to have the direct light on it. So just being conscious of how much exposure over time.
Okay. When you put the string at the back, you enter it first, and then loop it on the other side. Then pasok ko kayo ulit dun sa string. Then pull ganito. Para hong nakalock. So, can you show the photo image of the... There's instruction how to lock the string.
We've come across a lot of accidents. That's why we pay attention to the string methods. That sometimes when artworks are wired and just twisted, it just sort of slips. So we've had a lot of accidents, whether it be works on paper or paintings. So this is one method that we use just to make sure it's really locked in and the artwork doesn't fall off of the wall.
So yesterday I told you that you get 1/3 of the total frame, and then from top you get the 1/3. Then you can adjust, but don't go beyond the 1/3. Okay, like this, it's about 24 inches, so it would be 8. So 8 inches will be here. You can go up, but don't go down anymore. Kasi parang masyadong naka-flat yung artwork nyo.
Hi, excuse me. Yeah. Some artworks on paper come framed, but when in the frame they use matting borders made of materials like abaca or even textiles. Is that something that would pose danger to the artwork itself? Would you recommend that we immediately change that into something that's acid-free?
What we find is when you do see those linens, I think it's the kind of textured textiles. We often find that the textiles themselves are fine, but it's the wood that it's mounted on that ends up introducing acidity. So oftentimes framers, for example, might wrap plywood. They might wrap, whether it be the expander or even sometimes a floating frame, maybe you've seen, where they'll stretch sort of like a textile over wood and then mount the artwork on it. So what ends up happening there is the acidity migrates from the plywood to the textile, then to the artwork. In order to maintain that aesthetic, which is actually really nice, I do like seeing textured framing, you can just swap out the wood behind. So the framer can do it, but just stretch the tela on like a foam board as opposed to a plywood. And the textile itself is fine.
Something that looks like piña or abaca used as a border, that's fine?
It should be fine.
Okay.
It doesn't have significant amounts of acidity that would migrate through. But the question would be, how is it mounted? Are you thinking of abaca? Are you thinking of the expander of the frame?
Yeah, it is.
So if there's, so maybe if you're thinking about the expander, and I'll just demonstrate what we mean by that. Does this have a matting? Sorry. So are you thinking about the matting?
Yes, the brown.
Okay. So in that case, our concern would be what is touching the artwork. So what we tend to do is, because we try also not to interfere with aesthetic and stylistic. I mean, some of the materials really are so beautiful. We just make sure that we intervene from the back. So behind the matting, we often will then put an acid-free barrier behind so that the print underneath the matting is not touching the abaca, for example. That's definitely possible.
All right.
And sometimes you'll even see double matting. Sometimes I've seen 2 layers where you could use an acid-free layer initially and then the abaca over top, and it'll just have a little fillet that sort of frames it. You could do that too.
Thank you.
So this is the finished product. And the framing. So ito yung sinasabi ko na sometimes don't put it down kasi baka tamaan yung foam board at tumagos yung sa object nyo. Kaya nilalagay namin yan mostly dun sa taas, or yung pag nakikita nyo yung foam, yung matting nyo medyo malapad. So pwede nyong ilagay banda yan. Huwag lang dun sa tapat ng artwork. Kasi sometimes ang ginagamit sa residence is yung pako dun sa wall. Sinasabit na lang. O, hindi nila alam, baka mamaya nagkakaroon ng force. Makikita nyo na lang may bukol na yung on yung object. So, that's it for the demo. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Rod. Okay.